John, thanks for the kind words. Now I have to pay you back later for saying all those nice things. But appreciate y'all coming out, and I really appreciate the invitation to come talk about our 300-day grazing program. That this started back in 2008 in Arkansas, and it was a product of, if you remember about that time, that's when feed, fertilizer, fuel, everything was just going straight up in cost. And so we had a advisory meeting with our county agents. You know, what can we do to help improve producers' bottom line? And they thought, well, let's see if we can manage our biggest resource for cattle production, and that's our forages, and see if we can improve that. And so after a lot of discussion, we came up with this demonstration program. But recognize Kenny Simon. He's our animal science program associate that runs our farm demonstrations. Shane Gadberry is our beef nutritionist. Paul Beck is recently retired and actually gone to Oklahoma State now, but he did a lot of our forage research. We'll talk about some of that. Dirk Phillip was involved with the forage side. Tom Troxel was our department head, but he also worked a lot on the economic analysis side. And Steve Jones did a lot of work with the horses and small ruminants. And then Don Hubble is the Batesville Experiment Station director, where we did one of the demonstrations, and I'll talk about that as we go on. But if I get to talking too fast and don't give you detail that you, or skip over something, a detail, be sure and just say, hey, wait a minute, you know, what, you missed something there, I'm not quite clear. I don't want to be like the county agent that can you hear back there? They're recording it, yes, and so they'll post it, I guess, on your YouTube. Yeah. So, and then they'll pay me royalties on everything, you know. So yeah, I'm going to retire off of that. But anyway, I don't want to be like the county agent. You know, this is back in the days before Google, where you know you could look up everything on Google now that's true and honest and whatever. But you know, this new county agent, he started and he was sorting through files from his predecessor and trying to get everything organized. Where you know he spent the first several days, you know, after he started work, finally got everything where thought he could find answers. And no sooner than he got that done, he got a phone call. And there's a lady on the line, and she said, young man, how long after I put the rooster in with the hens does it take for the eggs to be fertile? And he thought a minute. He remembered putting all that poultry information in one of his files. And so he just turned around, he was reaching for that file cabinet door, and he said, just a minute, ma'am. She said, thanks, that's all I need to know. And she hung up. And so if I give you a little bit too little detail on something, you know, stop me and we'll go from there. Okay, well, let's start through this. Talking about 300-day grazing, but I'm going to start off talking about hay first and why we want to extend our grazing season. And this is a graph. This shows Arkansas hay production per cow on a 5-year average, basically. And you can see it starts from back in 1956, back in here. And the line is relatively flat up until the late 70s, early 80s, and then it just starts going up like that. What happened right here? Y'all remember what in late 70s, early 80s, what happened in our forage systems? Y'all remember the big round baler? That's about the time big round baler became popular. Because I remember making all my spending money in high school hauling square bales right here, and all at once Dad got his first round baler after all us kids left home. And and there's nothing wrong with the big round baler, but we changed the way we look at our forage management. Whereas when we're putting up small square bales with all the labor and everything, we put up good hay, we stored it in a barn, and we tried to take good care of it. When we put up big round bales, the thinking was, oh, you can store that out on the ground, it'll keep, you know, put it under the trees and wherever else out of the way. So now the cows are not necessarily eating more, but we need more because we're wasting a lot more. And we tend to bale anything we can get a twine around, especially in bad years. And so we don't do as good a job with our hay production. So it takes more. And so that number's been going up. Okay. Now, Gary Lacefield at the University of Kentucky did a survey a few years ago, and I thought this was really interesting how he presented this. He polled forage specialists in different states around the country, what is the average number of hay feeding days for your state? And there was a lot more questions in it, but I've condensed this down to just make a point here. In Arkansas, our average hay feeding season's around 135, 140 days. Starts usually mid-November, goes till about late March, somewhere in that ballpark. So that's about typical. And you get a bad year, yeah, it'll stretch one way or the other. But Wisconsin, their average 140 days. Missouri, their average 140 days. Mississippi, their average about 140 days. Now I know they ice fish up here, and we don't ice fish in Arkansas. And so, you know, if we got that kind of average going on and that sort of a climate difference, you know, can we do better, especially in southern climates where we have a good opportunity to stretch that grazing season out? Okay. So a common forage system, and this is, you know, for Arkansas conditions, I'll just talk about what is very common. We either have Bermuda grass or a warm season grass base in the southern half of the state, or we have a fescue base in the northern half of the state, okay? And then what we do is we start feeding hay sometime in fall, and we feed more hay late in winter, and until we're really tired of feeding hay in the spring. And then what do? We start baling hay. We bale more hay until we're really tired of baling hay, and then we're right back in, you know, it's a circle. And so when we talk about to people about trying to extend their grazing season and do some things, and they'll point to that big pile of hay that they've got baled out there. What do I do with all that hay? You know, you got to make that change at some point. And so we bale hay all summer and we feed hay all winter. The key point is growing a pasture crop takes exactly the same management as growing that hay crop. Exactly the same management, but you try to do it for each season of the year. Now, if you don't believe me, think about what do you do for growing a hay crop. You know, sometime in the spring, early summer, depending on which forage it is, maybe you'll clean up the field, you'll fertilize it to whatever amount you think it needs, you'll let it grow to a certain stage of maturity, and you harvest it. Growing a pasture crop, clean up the field, fertilize it to what you think it needs, let it grow to a certain stage, let the cows harvest it. But you try to do it for different seasons of the year, and you target that. And that's what this whole program is planning your season, at least a season ahead. And I'll talk about that and hit that over and over and over. Okay. Now, another thing that we typically see with our producers is they spend an awful lot of time feeding hay and harvesting hay. And so we've been doing some surveys and just to find out what that amounts to. And these are surveys done at some of our forage council meetings and things. So some of the producers are maybe on average a little bit larger. This group here was 122 average head of cattle. Our average herd in Arkansas is 35 to 40. So you see we're a little bit on the upper end of that with this group. But the hours spent feeding hay per day is about an hour and a half to feed in the wintertime. And you see there's a range there. The total feeding hours per winter, 243. And so that particular, and a total hay feeding days, 154. That was a winter where it was dry in the fall, so we started feeding hay early, and winter didn't let go, so we fed hay on in April that particular year. Cost per day, $150. Cost per winter, almost $24,000 on it. This is an average. So you can see every day that we can cut out hay feeding, you know, is that much potentially. And yeah, there's a lot of range in here, and you can just see where you might fall in that. So this is not statistical. This is just what they reported. Okay, so here's a quote I thought was interesting. It says, the farmer who has plenty of grass is the one who is allowed to get a start in the spring and early summer. The stock work on the reserves through the hot weather, and then in the fall, the cooler weather and rains, pastures start growing vigorously again. If not overstocked, they get another reserve that makes pasture all winter. Some farmers keep their stock on pasture all year, except when the snow's on the ground. This is practiced throughout the states of the Central South. That could have been in anybody's newsletter in the last 30 days. But that was in the Southern Agriculturalist in 1918. Okay, so a lot of times we just forget our history, okay, what we knew. So when we started this 300-day grazing program, the agents wanted to have this spread out enough where we could have producers jump in at whatever point they were in. Not just change their whole operation, but give them an opportunity to try different practices to see how it might fit their operation. So we came up with 8 different projects and then some whole farm demonstrations. So we wanted to look at just improved grazing management, and that can mean a lot of things. Using legumes, reducing hay losses during storage, reducing hay losses during feeding, stockpiling Bermuda grass, stockpiling fescue, using winter annuals, using summer annuals. And then we had some whole farms where we tried several of these to actually hit that 300-day grazing mark. And then we had what we called a verification farm, which is a research station at Batesville, where we managed a herd ourselves as a bunch of professors that really don't know anything to see if we could make it work, you know, using the same recommendations we made to everybody else. So it was our demonstration farm. So Here's kind of how we went through it. But we were able to document over 300 on-farm demonstrations, over $1 million in direct savings to producers, not each, but spread out. And then, so it's been pretty effective, and we still have producers doing different phases of this. So it's not a program, like I said, where we tell you to change your whole operation. We start with what you got. And so it's a 5-step process, and we want to start with an inventory of your forage base. What do you have to work with? And that's what we want to start with, what you have. And then determine what management practices we can add to that base that you already have to get more grazing out of that. And there's a lot of things that are possible. And then if we have any gaps in there, what complementary forages can we add to that system? And then we want to plan those forage and grazing practices out for the year ahead. Once you know what you have and what you need, how you need to make that grow, you can put it on the calendar, and it works. Just like growing that hay crop. You know, if you fertilize at this time, you're going to harvest hay crop about this time. Same way with pasture crop. And then we want to monitor and adjust and make any changes, keep some records so we know we can tweak it and make it better as we go along. So this inventory, it's real simple. Don't make this complicated. You can take a notebook, pad, or you can make a real nice sheet, and we have one online where it has most of the forages and weeds we expect to find in a pasture, or you can make something as simple as writing grass, clover, weeds, and bare ground on a sheet and walk across the field. And every 5 steps or so, when your boot hits the ground, look at the end of your toe, and if that's a clover plant right there, you can tally clover. Okay? Don't make it complicated. If you can tell grass and clover and weeds and bare ground, you can do an effective inventory. If you can tell fescue from Bermuda grass and Bahia grass and crabgrass, you can make a better inventory. Okay? So you know what you have and when it should be growing during the year. And then you can get your percentages here and know what you're dealing with and what you can do to make it better. Okay? So you always say plan your production season at least 1 season ahead, because you have all these different options and they don't grow all year round. And so you may need to plan 30 days from now to make sure that forage is there 30 days from now. So we have spring options, you know, fescue, orchard grass, annual ryegrass, small grains, different clovers, maybe for the spring. You have Bermuda, Bahia, summer annuals, Lespedeza, native warm season grasses for the summer. And then we get into the fall, we have a lot of our spring forages coming back, and plus some warm season options, and then we have some options for the winter. You don't have to have all those. We've had producers do 300-day grazing, and I'll talk to you about, you know, how they did that with one of these and one of these. Okay? As long as you have a warm season and a cool season component and you have the management practices to make that fit. Okay? I'm going to get a drink here. Okay. All right. So we get into that number 2 step. What beneficial practices can we add to that base once we know what that base is to improve our grazing management? Again, we start with that existing forage base. We want to reduce our hay waste to lower our hay need, because we do waste a lot of hay. We want a soil test to improve our fertility management. I didn't say application, but management. We want to target fertilizer applications when we do put them out, so we can make sure we get grass to grow when we need it to grow, but we don't put it all out at the same time. A lot of times when producers fertilize, you know, they fertilize all in the spring, and then what happens? You've got grass, you know, belly deep on all the cows, and they can't graze it all at once. And then a lot of it goes to waste, gets mature. But if we target it, and we put out some for the spring, some for the summer, maybe some for fall and stockpile, we get it's more efficient, and we produce what we need. Okay? And then stockpiling to extend the fall and winter grazing season, and then using that improved grazing management, and that can be rotational grazing, it can be strip grazing in the wintertime, it can be a lot of different things. Okay? So, improving our hay storage and management, what we have seen on some of our demonstrations is that when we stored hay in the barn, we had about just under 10% loss. When we stored it outside uncovered, we had over 25% loss. So over 2.5 times more. And so right there we can make an impact just on not having to have as much hay if we protect it better, like we used to with square bales. Now hay feeding, if we fed it in a ring, we had about 13% waste that we measured, 24% waste where we unrolled it. And I know a lot of people unroll hay and they'll unroll just what the cows will eat, but this is a case where they unrolled, you know, more and the cows would waste a lot, lay on it and whatever. And we had one producer that had a grinder type equipment, and he was able to process that hay and feed it in tubs, he had less than 1%. You know, more equipment, but he had it available, so he was able to make good use of that. Now, we get into drought conditions, and Kenny Simon, our program associate, he's got his own farm, and we got into 2012. Now, I don't know if it's drought over here, but it was one of the worst we've ever had in Arkansas. And he was having to buy hay, and it was costing him, you know, $65 to $75 a round bale, if you could find it. And when he'd roll that hay out, the cows were standing all over it, stomping it, and getting a lot of waste. Well, he uses a lot of electric fence, temporary electric fence, and he had his Kawasaki mule out there and had a roll of polywire on it. And he was watching those cows and thought, So he just took that polywire reel, hooked it onto his electric fence, and ran it right down over the top of that hay. The cows lined up just like they were at a feed bump. And so that's why he started feeding his hay for the rest of the summer, and he cut down his waste quite a bit doing that, and he started doing it in the winter. And when he finally tweaked that a little bit, and he decided that he could stage that hay out alongside the field on the weekend when he had time. So he's what they call a flashlight farmer. You all know what a flashlight farmer is, you know. So when if he could do that, and he could roll out 3 or 4 days worth of hay at one time and put that hot wire right here. And so that way when he got home in the evening, it took him 10 or 15 minutes to go down and move that hot wire to the next roll of hay. Or if he couldn't get it done, his 12-year-old son could do it for him. So, you know, that's the way to kind of improve efficiency. And it helps to have these perfectly rectangular fields like everybody in South Carolina does with water at one end, so you can just walk right across the field. But that was a principle that, you know, is pretty effective for him, and then all the nutrients of that hay gets worked in as you go across the field. Okay, so that's the next point. And what we've seen, a lot of producers, when they do feed their hay, they like to find that one dry spot on the farm, and they'll feed hay there till the nutrients actually stack up enough to raise the elevation of that hill. And so we started looking at how much nutrients in that hay. And on an average 4x5 round bale of Bermuda grass hay, according to our forage testing lab, when we do the calculation, it has about 16 pounds of nitrogen, 5 pounds of phosphate, and 18 pounds of potash, somewhere in that range, and there's, I know, variation in there. But if you look at that in big round numbers, that's like about 100 pounds of triple 17 fertilizer in every bale. So why can't we try to use that? And producers have done it for years, they just never measured it. You know, feed it in different places to improve fertility. And we did that in some farms, and this is just a selection of a few, and we saw, you know, fairly large range. But here we increased phosphorus, you know, 92 pounds per acre here, 20 here, 22 here, potash 170 up to a little over 200, you know, by feeding hay in this might be a small field, but instead of one spot, they were, you know, moving the ring or unrolling in a different spot every time they fed and spreading it out. And then you could think, instead of just having that one dry spot, when you have a dry part of the winter, feed in those wet spots where you don't normally get to, and, you know, other spots you need to increase that fertility. And so that's something to keep in mind in your total management program. So this targeted fertilization I talked about, a lot of times we can push grass to do something that nature is not going to make it do on its own by fertilizing a little bit earlier or fertilizing during a different time of the year. And these are a couple of cases here where producers fertilized mid to late February on ryegrass, and they were grazing. You know, this picture here was taken March 23rd. This was March 28th. You can see when he turned those steers in there, actually the grass was already ahead of the calves, and he'd already grazed through part of that field already. He was doing it, you know, strip grazing through. You can see how much growth there was. And right here's a line across that field. Fertilizer truck was able to do this side of the field. This side over here is a little wet, didn't get into. This ryegrass is 3 inches tall. That was over 10 inches tall there. So that's how much impact early fertilization can have. This producer here had already grazed through that twice, and this was taken in late March. And so you can push grass to do something earlier or make it last later by targeting your fertilization date. So something to think about. Now, stockpiling forages for winter, this is another one of those cases. Excuse me. But it really makes a big impact for your fall and winter. We stockpile Bermuda grass. You can also stockpile hay grass, and Dallas grass works pretty well as also. And we stockpile fescue. Program is basically the same. Dates are just a little bit different. You know, we soil test like every agronomist will tell you to do. We clean off that old growth by early August for our conditions for Bermuda grass. put on 50 or 60 pounds of actual in early August, try to get done before mid-August. We let that grass grow till mid-October. By then the nights are cool enough that Bermuda grass has stopped growing, and we can strip graze it out, and we can graze that all the way to Christmas time, and it still makes good feed. Now, fescue a little bit later, clean off that old growth by late August, fertilize it about September the 1st, let it grow till 1st of December. We can strip graze it out, and we can graze all the way into February as long as we have enough grass. And so you can see the two things can dovetail together pretty nicely. Yes, sir. Okay. Good question. Oh. Thank you. I just about wore that. Thank you. Okay. Clean it off. Try to get it grazed short or clipped off. We have producers say, well, I'll just brush hog it. Well, how close do you brush hog normally? 6, 8, 10 inches. A lot of times you don't get it down here that 3 or 4. And what we've seen, yeah, the grass will grow above that, but when the cows go back to graze it, they'll graze it down to that brush hog layer. And then they'll wallow the rest of it around and won't eat it. So what we've seen is, Bermuda or fescue, what they didn't graze the first time, they don't graze the second time either. So we want to start off with clean, new growth. So basically like a hay clipping, but about 3 or 4 inches. We don't leave the old summer junk on there. Some people call that stockpile, but that's cardboard with a root. Okay. So, but we look at on big averages, and we've seen a lot of variation around this, but savings per animal unit runs somewhere around $58, and that's a 1,000-pound animal unit. And we get an extra 110 days of animal unit grazing days per acre. And we've seen this number up to 200, and we've seen that number quite a bit higher as well. And so, but these are just some averages. But you can take that number and multiply it by your farm, and see what is potential. Okay, with stockpiling just a little bit further, we've seen if we strip graze it, we can double the number of grazing days that we get versus just turning the cows out. And by strip grazing, a lot of our producers like to take that single polywire and they'll move it about twice a week, or maybe about every 2-3 days. You can move it every day if you want, but for them, a lot of them is comfortable to move it about twice a week. But that saves an extra $10 per animal unit versus continuous grazing or just turning them out. Saves 1 to 2 hours a day hay feeding time. And then electric fence construction, when we had some producers that were going to subdivide their farm, and instead of using barbed wire like they were considering doing, and we got them to use high tensile electric fence and then temporary wire too, they were able to save almost $15,000 for that group of producers versus using traditional fence. And so there's another benefit there too. So there's a lot of these things kind of stack up as you go. Now, we look at that stockpile situation. This field here, actually, when we looked at that in August for this producer to stockpile that grass, it was as brown crunchy, it's about as tall as this carpet, and it was 98 degrees when we looked at that. And we got him to fertilize it, and it made a pretty nice stockpile for that winter when he grazed the calves. But what some of the producers had told us, just a few quotes, is that one producer said feeding hay took nearly half a day every day. Moving a polywire for strip grazing stockpile takes 30 minutes twice a week. And so that's how much time that producer saved. Another one said, as long as I'm grazing stockpile, I have time to move the fences before I go to work in the morning. When it runs out and I have to start feeding hay, I feed in the morning, and I have to finish at night when I get home. So, and another one, he said it takes me and my 6-year-old son about 35 minutes twice a week to move that electric fence wire on stockpile Bermuda and fescue for 250 cows. There's no way I can feed hay that fast, and it's a lot cheaper. And so, they're really seeing that benefit. So the third point, complementary forages, kind of getting into some of the work we've been doing here to try to fill in, but that's where we can use legumes, we can use annual ryegrass, small grains, brassicas, summer annuals in the fall, and but that first grazing depends on that planting date. And so we'll talk about how this might all fit. With legumes, we had some producers that planted clover, and they were able to save $4,600, or a couple of producers, versus using N on grass to get the same amount of grazing when we were able to calculate that through. And on the winter annuals, using the ryegrass and the small grains, we were able to calculate they saved on average $83 per animal unit. And this is wintertime grazing, fall and winter, before the middle of April when they would be feeding hay. This wasn't counting the April on grazing that they would get in the spring anyway. And so see about total savings about $2,000 per farm and about 47 additional animal unit grazing days. So that's just some averages there. But I mentioned that first grazing depends on planting date. And this is some work that we've been doing more recently. This is at Fayetteville, and was on tilled seedbed. But when we planted in August, the end of August, the 24th actually, this is a winter oat versus planting on October the 12th. This picture was taken November 21st. You see those oats were headed out. Those oats were about 4 inches tall. And so if we planted early, we had all this potential grazing in the fall here. Planted late, this is spring grazing only. And so, and you don't have to do all of it. Like we tell producers all the time, you can do part of it this way, you do part of it this way. If you need whatever gap to fill that puzzle in the fall, you can do so many acres and then do some more later. Okay, this is some dry matter yields of that particular project. Was the year before in 2016, where we planted spring oats. Here we got about 3,600 pounds of dry matter by November 22nd when we planted that on August 24th. The next one was forage rape, Nebraska, about 3,000 pounds. Next one was winter oat. We're looking at 2,700 pounds or so, and then it starts dropping off with the traditional small grains. Now, when we planted on October 11th, and we measured November 22nd, none of them got over about 1,200 pounds of dry matter. And 1,200 pounds is kind of where Paul Beck had always said that we need to be to really turn cattle out, to sustain any kind of grazing. And so we didn't hit that with the October planting by fall, but we sure did with early planting. So again, when do you need the grazing? When do you need to plant? So, but everybody says you can't plant in end of August. It's too hot, it's too dry, it's too this, it's too that. And then we look at a situation here. This is where we planted some of that ryegrass early, and it was that particular year is overrun with some annual stink grass, so it's a warm season weedy grass. And this is planted in October, had nice rows. Not a lot of difference between yield. People look at that and say, see, I told you, it won't work. So, yeah, growing winter annuals has in the fall, planting early has that risk of hot, dry weather. So what can you do? So, and I was looking at the weather records for Little Rock just this year. And we look at the days over 90 degrees, the days over 95 degrees. In August, we had 20 days over 90, and the average is 20 days over 90, and the average is 31. We had 6 days over 95, the average is 0. September, we had 19 days, this is about the same number, over 90, and 5 over 95. And so it's a very hot September this year, and it was dry. And so everybody look at that and says, see, I told you. So what can we do? People look at that and say, yeah, that's, global warming, it's climate changes, whatever. I don't know if it's climate change, but it could be climate weirdness, okay? Just things happen. So what can we plant that'll tolerate that? Summer annuals tolerate hot weather. And so we've been looking at that work, trying to plant that at the end of summer to get that fall yield, to tolerate that hot weather, we can make some fall pasture. And these are plots that we planted the 30th of August last year. We took this picture on October the 11th. 42 days, 6 weeks we were able to do that. Now this was on tilled seedbed, but we've done it on sod seeded as well. So we look at those yields. And this was last year's harvest. Planted the 30th of August, harvested the middle of October about. And you see where we had sorghum Sudan, we had pearl millet, both those right around that 3,400 pound dry matter range. We had brown top millet, about 2,500 pounds. We had 3 different types of corn in that 26 to 3,000 pound dry matter range. None of these were statistically different, and that I think that's a good thing, because that tells me whatever you can find seed availability of, plant it, and you're going to have something that's good to graze in October. And then what we've been doing on some farm demonstrations is starting to plant underneath that at the same time, planting ryegrass or some small grains, and we can graze this summer annual off, and possibly that winter annual is left underneath for spring later on. And so we're doing that on demonstrations to see how that might fit. So if we're going to plant into Bermuda grass sod, you do have to do some sod suppression or some tillage. And we have seen that. This is a particular field over in Yale County by Danville. And you can see where we were able to get we applied a light rate of glyphosate, a pint per acre, and we got a pretty good stand of corn in that Bermuda grass sod. Right here is a line, and you see that there's virtually nothing and a pretty good stand on this side. That line is where the county agent went back out to spray it. We drilled it, in that Bermuda grass, and it was short, hadn't been mowed too long before, it was greening back up. He sprayed it with that Roundup, went back to fill up his tank, and it started raining. So this was on there about 30 minutes. And we still got enough suppression where that corn stand came in pretty good. Where we did not get it sprayed and where it started raining, you can hardly find anything. And it was filled with foxtail and crabgrass and other things, which, yeah, that's grazable forage, but not, it doesn't fit the same gap that does, quality-wise and other things. So you see that suppression does make a difference. Okay, well, what about planting in the spring? We get producers that say, yeah, you can't plant in August. It's too hot, it's too dry. I didn't get it planted in October because whatever. And then we always get these calls in February. And, you know, what can I plant for a spring hay crop? Well, usually we'd say a small grain of some kind, but, you know, when, how much, what one is the best, and so on. So we put together some research to look at that. And this is a set of winter annuals that we planted on October 11th, harvested that the next April. And you can see we had a coker oat, which is a winter oat. We had a ryegrass, and then we had a spring oat, jerry oat. And jerry oat virtually all winter killed, which we expected. And then we had Elbon rye, we had a wheat, we had a brassica, which is a rape, and then we had Dixie crimson clover. All those look great. Actually, some of them were, you know, more mature than, you know, ideal, but that was the date we had on our calendar to harvest. So we planted that same complement of forages, but we planted those first week of March, but we were only able to harvest them by May 25th. So it took 5 more weeks to get the growth, but we also saw that coker oat did well, the Jerry spring oat did well, planted in spring, and our ryegrass did very well. But our cereal rye, that's on average is only about 40%, less than 40% headed out. Our wheat was nearly 0 headed out. Brassicas didn't do well, and our Dixie crimson clover didn't do well. Now, what happened with our small grains? By planting that late, they did not vernalize. And vernalization is a process from the small grain. It has to have a cold temperature, short night stimulus, or long night stimulus to make that produce a stem, a seed head. And if it doesn't get that stimulus, it doesn't produce that seed head, so you get some small leafy growth and doesn't do much. And that's what we saw here. Now, that's probably variety dependent, and there's others, but we did see with either oat or the ryegrass, it didn't have that requirement, and they did well in the spring. So we look at the yields there. You know, with our fall planted, the green bars, here's, you know, the rye, the wheat, the winter oat, the ryegrass, crimson clover, they all did well. When we look at the spring planted, neither the rye or wheat did well. The winter oat did pretty well. The ryegrass did pretty well. The spring oats did pretty well on yield. Not too much different than their fall planted counterpart. And so that's something to think about if you're planting for a spring hay crop. But also remember that it'll be about 5 weeks later than the same thing planted in the fall. So it's not the same harvest date. Okay? All right. Now, did I mess up something? Okay. See where I'm at. All right, now talk about our 300-day grazing demonstration farms. And we had remember I talked about the whole farm demonstrations where those producers tried to hit several demonstrations to hit that 300-day grazing mark. And we had one in Randolph County, one in Lawrence County, one down here in Van Buren County, and this is the Batesville Research Station where we managed it ourselves as professors. Lawrence County, they were able to hit over 300-day grazing 3 out of 4 years. 2010 was a dry year for him. Van Buren County, they hit it first year. The next year was pretty close, and then they had a really dry year. Didn't quite get it, but still better than all his neighbors. Randolph County, you know, 2 out of 3 years, he was able to hit it, and again, that dry year there. And at the Batesville Research Station, we were able to make over 300-day grazing for 4 years. And then we hit 2012, and I'll talk about that. But the forage base on all these farms was fescue and clover and Bermuda grass. That was it. They didn't have all the, some of them started planting some complementary things in there, but we had fescue and clover in spring, Bermuda grass in the summer, combination of tail end of Bermuda grass stockpile, fescue and clover in the fall, and then stockpiled Bermuda and fescue on into the winter, and that was it. Not a big complicated list, but it was a management plan that made it work. So knowing when your forages should grow and plan at least one season ahead to make sure that that happens. Okay, so make sure you get it done on time. Yes, sir. On those particular farms, it didn't, but cover crops can fill that gap, just like a summer or winter annual. Yeah. So you look at, this is kind of like everybody has their own picture puzzle, and what pieces fill your gaps on your particular farm. And so if cover crops is, what you're working on, and you can make that fit that summer, fall, winter gap, think about what it is that you're planting, when you're going to be able to graze that, and get it done far enough ahead of time to fill that grazing gap. Okay, and that's what this whole thing is about, is planning it ahead, not just taking what nature gives you, because that doesn't always work. Okay, you have to plan it ahead. So this is the process on the Batesville Research Station. We had a fall calving herd, and that was the group of cows they had available for us to be able to use, 38 cows. They weaned the calves in May. We grazed them until July usually to put some extra weight on them before we would sell those. Had 130 acres of pasture and it's fescue. We added clover, didn't start out with clover. And then Bermuda grass, we had about 70 to 30 ratio of cool season, warm season. Stocking rate was about 2.5 acres per animal unit, so not heavy stock, but about moderate for Arkansas conditions. And then we did have electric fence and water for each pasture, because that was the way the station was already set up. So that was a big advantage to get started. Yes? Okay. Yes. No, they're separate. We had several fescue pastures and then 40 acres of Bermuda that we were able to subdivide. And that's a key point too. With trying to target these different seasons of the year, oftentimes it's good. Mixtures are fine, fescue, Bermuda, whatever. We have a lot of those in Arkansas. But when you really want to target Bermuda for the summer or stockpiling Bermuda, it's better to have Bermuda. When it's mixed with fescue, it's hard to target something because one's in the way of targeting the other one. Okay, I'm not saying you don't have some mixtures on the farm are fine. Same way with fescue. If you're trying to target stockpile fescue and you fertilize it, early, you're still promoting Bermuda grass that competes with your fescue and so on. So it's good to have some of these separate, and then clover in the fescue is fine. That works. Some Bermuda by itself is good, and then you can have mixtures in other fields. But when you have everything mixed and together, it's difficult to target what you're wanting to do for everything. Yes, sir. Well, these were all perennial pastures. And so once they're established, you just think, which one do I want to stockpile this year? How am I? And then you rotationally graze through the main part of the season. And we get up to that critical season like stockpiling, which pasture am I going to stockpile this year? And we didn't stockpile all the fescue, and we didn't stockpile all the Bermuda. We would pick out how much we thought we needed, and we'd fertilize that, and then the other part we knew would grow some without fertilization. And so we'd make sure we'd fertilize early when we needed it to push that growth a little faster on some pastures so we could get grazing earlier. And then the other we knew would catch up. And then we could graze that on in, as long as that season lasted. And then coming up ahead of the next season, say for Bermuda, we'd fertilize 10 acres out of the 40 to get it going a little earlier. When it came time to stockpile Bermuda, we'd fertilize 10 acres out of the 40. Same way with fescue. We pick out one fescue pasture to stockpile for December, January grazing, but the other, we had a lot of clover in, so we let that just grow up for fall grazing. So see, we kind of think about what season you need it to be there and make sure we push it to hit that mark. Okay, and once you kind of lay it all out and you have that inventory, and you know what practices that can work, you just start making your own calendar, your map. Okay. So, but this was our plan A, I'll call it, at Batesville. We had fescue and clover in the spring, and then we had Bermuda for summer and early fall, and then we had fescue and clover for our weaned calves in the spring, and then our lactating cows in the fall. So we tried to make sure we had a good clover pasture available for both of those. And in the springtime, since we didn't wean those calves till May, a lot of times if we just left that pasture grow up, the fescue would be this tall in May by the time we wanted to wean them, and the clover wouldn't be much. So we picked out, okay, we want to fence line wean those calves on this field. So we made sure we grazed that field 30 days before we were ready to wean. And that gets the canopy of that fescue down. So by the time we were ready to wean the calves, that red clover or white clover would be up in there like this. Okay, and so it was ready to go. And then we had stockpile fescue for the wintertime, and then we were back to spring again. And so not a lot of forages, but we soil tested, we fertilized by seasonal need, we rotation grazed, fence line wean those calves, strip grazed that forage in the wintertime, and again we hit 300-day grazing seasons 4 years in a row. Yeah. This we had one field of novel, and the rest of it was all Kentucky 31, but we tried to make sure we got as much clover as we could in all of it. And then with the rotational grazing, being able to get onto the Bermuda grass by the time hot weather came and things like that, and fall calving too, that makes a huge difference on the in-fight management. That helped us work around that. We still saw symptoms, but it wasn't as bad as the spring calving herd and no summer forage. Yes, sir. Not so much, because that was, even though it was a rocky field, that Bermuda was pretty productive. But what we also saw when we wanted to stockpile that fescue, say some of those fields would get some growing up in the summer. So before that it's time to stockpile the Bermuda, we'd try to put them back on some of that fescue, get that grazed down so we could get that ready for stockpiling. That gave us a little bit of a break, and then we could go back to the Bermuda again and graze it all the way till, cooler weather. And we had enough of it that it would stockpile ahead of them some years. And then by the time that was done, we could go on to the fescue clover and then the stockpile fescue after that. And so, just because you don't have them on a particular field, that field's not sitting there. Sometimes it'll grow. So you have that option going back and forth. And so that's how we manage this. Yeah. Yeah, it's 38 cows. I think it stayed close to that every year. So the strip grazing, we take that polywire across, whether it's Bermuda grass or fescue clover, depending on which one it was, and try to move it roughly twice a week. And we give them a strip of forage big enough, to fill that, and then just move it, about midweek. And since this was on research station, everybody's hourly. People aren't there on the weekends much, except, just the basic crew. And so we tried to manage things to happen during the week as much as we could. So, and you can move every day if you want. It's nothing wrong with that. Just twice a week for cow-calf production works pretty well. Okay. Yeah. When you have Bermuda and fescue and clover all in one pasture, just rotationally graze it until you're done. And if you that's about the best way, because you have a transition in there. You go from your cool season to your warm season. And if that transition happens late and you have too much shade of that cool season on your Bermuda, you delay your Bermuda. And so when you get to that point, I need this Bermuda grass pasture in June, let's say, just to pick a date. That fescue and clover needs to be grazed pretty hard back in April to get that sunlight in there for that Bermuda to start growing. If that doesn't get grazed till May, you delay that Bermuda grass till July. Okay, and we see that with ryegrass a lot, where somebody will miss getting a field cut for hay or grazed. That ryegrass will get this big and turn brown and fall over, and they'll lose one, sometimes two cuttings of Bermuda grass hay off that. And I've seen some of them so bad that it took the whole year to get that Bermuda grass to recover because of the shading effect. And so you got to plan around that shade. Bermuda grass, there's one way to control Bermuda grass above all else, and that's put shade on it. It does not tolerate it well. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. You try to get that Bermuda grass grazed down so your forages can come back for fall. And if some of it's getting ahead of you, that's where you have the option of either going in mowing or making hay. And another little point to think about, if that happens to you and you know this forage gets ahead because I don't have enough animals to graze it all, graze your rough pastures first. And that way, if it gets ahead of you, your smooth pastures are the ones that get ahead, and that's where you can make hay. A lot of people do it the other way around, and then the pastures ahead of them are so rough they can't make hay, and then that ends up that cardboard with a root on it. Okay. So again, just thinking about, okay, I know that season ahead, that season after that, this grass should do this. So make sure that you have that plan in place and don't get caught behind. So during the growing season, yeah, you have a back fence. On the wintertime, on stockpile, you don't need a back fence. And so that's another little point. Good point. Yeah.
You kind of alluded to it earlier. As we see seasons, becoming a little less predictable. Like I had my fescue was growing January. We had that cold spell in upstate last December where we had a snowstorm, and then pretty much after that, it was a very mild winter. I saw fescue growing all winter long, and I couldn't get my cows to graze it fast enough on those. Whereas I was just, more stuff dried on the stem. In the springtime, I was just trying to bale as much as possible just to get it off the ground and not have wasted cost.
Well, yeah, and that's another point too that we've talked to producers about. Just because you have extra forage does not mean you have to bale it for hay. Okay. You can go out and brush hog it down to reset that pasture and let that just decay into the ground, and that forage is still there, that nutrient's still there, and you only put the mowing cost in it, knowing that pasture will start to regrow as long as the conditions are there for that Bermuda fescue, whatever is there, and then you reset that pasture back into your rotation again. But if you bale it for hay, you put all that cost in there, and then you have all that extra hay, and then what do you do with it? You feed hay, and you feed hay till you're tired of feeding hay, until you're really tired of feeding hay. Yeah. Right.
Really, in the summertime, it's outdoor storage, so it wasn't great quality.
Right.
So I was essentially giving the hay away to neighbors. I had
it. But every bale you gave away, that was about $30 of cost between your nutrient and your machine time and your labor and everything else you had in it. If you had just mowed it and let it lay and reset that pasture. So, when you don't have enough cows to keep up with it, mowing and letting it lay is really not a bad thing. You're just resetting that pasture for your next season of growth. Okay. So don't think of it as being, bad. Right. And
that's why I always have one barn full of hay, and then all the rest is outdoor storage, which is really just that emergency hay, and the indoor, barn stored hay is what
right.
My heifers will get through the winter time.
Well, yeah, the barn stored is what you can save. Anything outside feed it. I tested some hay for a guy one time, and he said, "Yeah, that hay is in a barn loft, so it's always dry." He said that hay is old enough to vote. It'd been in there for 18 years, really, and it was still intact. Protein was 8-point-something% protein, is mid-50s TDN. I was amazed, but it's still there. Now I don't know how palatable it was being dry and dusty and whatever, but the test said quality there. But yeah, we're not saying 365-day grazing, we're saying 300, and that's the reason. Basically, we got that question before. Why are you doing 300 instead of 365? Well, if I'd talked to somebody that's feeding hay 140, 150 days a year, half the year basically. And I said, yeah, you need to go this 365-day grazing. They quit listening immediately. That won't work. 300-day grazing, you cut your hay feeding season in half. Okay, I'll listen for a minute. And then you talk about, okay, you can do this, maybe cut off 30 days here, do this, cut a week or two here. And then I want to say, hey, maybe I can do that. So, yeah, but I'm not saying no hay. Yeah, you do need that emergency because we get snow and ice and we get droughts, things like that. And I'll show you in a minute why it is important to have that. Yeah. Okay, with rotational grazing is what we do during the growing season, and you might have paddocks or a back wire if you're all temporary wire. Yeah, and you're moving the cows to different paddocks, and it could be on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis. There's a lot of. Well, strip grazing is where we take one pasture and we take that single hot wire and we go across it and we give them a strip big enough for a day, 2, 3 days. Let them graze that strip down and move it ahead. And usually strip grazing, we're doing that on our dormant stockpiled forage. If it's during the growing season, then you have to have a back wire behind it and you're going across, that would be like rotational. We're rotating through our system, different pastures. Strip grazing, I guess the true definition would be on dormant stockpiled forage that we don't have anything regrowing. We're just grazing strips like standing hay. Yeah, strip grazing would be like feeding standing hay. It could be strip grazing. Yeah, you just go right across the field and you know nothing's coming back behind, but you're rationing out what they get. Okay, and that's about as clean as I can define it. Yes. That's a good question. Horses are special animals, but usually, and you can do it if you're afraid of taking them full on. You can let them in for an hour a day, 30 minutes a day, and then kind of back and forth until they get acclimated. And that would be like, fescue clover. Sometimes we have fields of clover that's really, really high percentage clover. And rather than dumping a lot of animals out there unacclimated to that clover and having bloat potential problems, you let them graze, let them fill up on other pasture or hay, and let them in there for less than an hour or 2 hours a day, and do that for several days till they acclimate, and then you can go full grazing, and then the same thing when you go back later to the forage that you had been on. But just kind of introduce it slowly. Don't ever turn them out when they're empty and they're full or hungry. Because then they'll tend to gorge on things, and some horses are more prone to founder and all kinds of things like that. So, but just do it slowly. And I know on real high quality lush forages like ryegrass and clovers and things like that, you can get more of those issues in horses. Bermuda grass is usually not as much of a problem. It's a lot more fiber in it anyway. So, but okay. So this is the basic program that we used on the Batesville station. You can see we had basically 2 forages, or 3, fescue, clover, Bermuda grass. Okay, but it was the planting that we used. All right, so then we get into 2012, and I'd mentioned this 2 or 3 times. That was one of the worst droughts that we've had on record in Arkansas. I took this picture on June the 8th, and that's when grass should have still been nice and green growing. This is our Bermuda grass field. You can see that calf kicking up dust going across there. So virtually nothing was growing. The drought had already set in by that point. So we were trying to decide at that point, what are we going to do? We knew we had, typically we kept those calves on into July and, try to hit a little higher market. We put extra weight on them. That wasn't happening that year. We didn't have enough grass to keep them gaining weight, so we sold them early that year just to get that load off the pastures. We rotated pastures what we had, and that's strip grazing when things weren't growing. That we kind of did that with the cow herd, and we strip grazed through. We thought at that point we had maybe 3 weeks of pasture, with the cows, and then we were done. And if it didn't rain, and that's about what we did. But before we started grubbing down to the roots, when we still had good stubble left on pasture, we pulled the cows off. And so we put them in a thin, we had one pasture that never was very good quality, didn't have a good stand of anything. So we put them on that as a sacrifice field, and we started feeding hay. Just to protect, because we knew sometime it was going to rain. Just didn't know when. Everybody in Arkansas was convinced it's never going to rain again, on and on and on, so they wouldn't do anything. So we planned everything after that for pasture recovery. When this thing breaks, how are we going to line up our dominoes? Okay? And so we had these different options. We were feeding hay. We knew we could plant some winter annuals. We could have some stockpiled forages. We had Johnson grass that was coming up in some of the fields, but it's twisted and wilted, and we couldn't use it. And we had all these different things that potentially available. So here was our plan. And we were feeding hay in Bermuda in the summer. And then as we were watching the weather forecast, Hurricane Isaac was starting to form. And it kept moving closer and closer to the Gulf. Nobody had a good track on it. They didn't know where it was going to go. But we were talking, we had a pretty good idea because there's 2 political conventions that year. Here we're on the East Coast. And we thought there's enough hot air from those that's going to push that thing west. And so we thought it's going to get on into the Gulf and we may get rain. Well, it did actually. And it hit right around Louisiana, Texas, and then moved north. And so right at the end of August, that drought broke. We got a couple inches of rain, the temperature broke. And so we put all this in place before that ever happened. Thought, how can we stack this up? And it actually did work. So we had all this Johnson grass, and it was all twisted and wilted and high potential prussic acid poisoning. We were afraid to use it. When it rained, after a week or so, it freshened up, looked great. We were able to start grazing it. So we got 6 weeks or so out of that. We had some Bermuda. We'd fertilized a paddock back in the summer when we had a chance of rain that didn't happen, but that fertilizer was there. That started growing in the fall once we got rain, so we were able to graze that plus some other grasses that grew up in it. We had 4 acres of alfalfa. It grew a little bit. We were able to graze that off. Back here where we fed that hay in that sacrifice field, it was not a good field, so we tilled it up, planted wheat and turnips right here just before that rain hit. We were able to start grazing that later in the fall. We had Johnson grass and fescue. We grazed this up until frost. Went to these. After frost, we came back and cleaned up the Johnson grass and fescue after the frost, when we didn't have prussic acid. We had fescue that stockpiled on its own. We'd spent our fertilizer money up here doing this. And so, again, we had a budget we imposed on that. So it wasn't a free government program. We did have a budget we were trying to stay within. And so fescue stockpiled on its own. We were feeding hay and some limited grazing on some winter annuals because we had one fescue field that got a lot of damage from the drought. And we thought, well, we'll just renovate that and plant novel fescue. And so we killed it out back here and planted wheat as part of the rotation. That wheat was ready to graze here with some, a couple days a week and feeding hay the rest of the time. So we fed 49 hay days in the summer. We fed 37 days in the winter. We made a 279-day grazing season. We missed 300 days by 3 weeks on one of the worst droughts by trying to stack all that up like that together. So always plan at least one season ahead because you never know what's going to happen in 30 days from now. Nobody can predict that, okay? And here's the case. Here's the Johnson grass. We couldn't use it. High potential prussic acid poisoning. Here it is after it rained. We were strip grazing it out. Worst forage, best forage in less than a month. Here's our Bermuda grass. We had fertilized some of it. That was only about 2-3 inches tall. We were protecting it. When it started growing back, we had it and some other grasses came in there. We were able to graze it 6 weeks. Here's the brassica and wheat that we'd planted right after we planted. It didn't look like much. This is it in the mid-November. Okay? So when you have that plan in place, things can happen, good or bad in 30 days, but if you have a plan in place, you can take advantage. Now, Paul Beck, I mentioned he did some research on this, and he had some different treatments. I'll try to get through this quick. He had a continuous grazing system. This is on a Bermuda grass base. He had a moderate management and a high management. With his continuous, he didn't rotation graze, didn't stockpile, didn't plant any winter annuals. 259 days grazing, which is actually pretty good. Moderate management, he did rotation graze, he stockpiled, planted winter annuals, 350 days grazing. And this, 2 acres per cow calf. Had a high management, 1 acre per cow calf. He did all these things, still made over 300 days grazing. How did he do it? This was his plan. He had Bermuda grass here through the warm season. He came back here in mid-August, pulled 25% of that Bermuda grass acreage out, and fertilized it to stockpile it. Okay, so that means he fenced that off, fertilized it. He was able to start grazing that stockpile in October, and he grazed it all through down into the winter. When the cows went on the stockpile, he took another 25% and he planted his winter annuals, which is wheat and ryegrass. Cows were grazing the stockpile while this was getting established. By January, February, depending on the year, this was ready to start grazing, limited grazing in the late winter with a little bit of hay, and by spring it was going full force. He grazed that until he's back on Bermuda grass. Okay. Now he did, some years he had to feed a little bit of hay here in the fall because the stockpile wasn't quite ready. And he said, I realize it's not a lot nicer feeding hay in October than it is January and February. And then sometimes you have to feed a little bit of hay here at the end of the winter before it finally kicked in the spring, but much less than typical season. Yeah. It would have been, depending on the year, late September into mid-October. And then that, for South Arkansas, that would start growing, through the sometime in the fall, and then he could limit graze it here late in the winter. And so, but October would be a typical time. But usually about here, mid-October is when he'd go on the stockpile Bermuda grass. That freed up some more Bermuda acres here, so he took that half acre per cow, which is 25%, and planted those winter annuals. So see, you're planting, cows got to be somewhere, but not on, if you've got a cow standing on every acre, this is hard to do. But, here he had stocking rate of 2 acres per cow-calf unit, and so he'd pull out a section to do this and a section to do this as you went through each different deal. Now,
When was your frost freeze period in there? What did that do to the quality of the Bermuda grass?
okay, that's a good point. What's pasture or frost do to the quality of stockpile Bermuda grass? If it's set up the way I talked about, where you do it in mid-August or so, and you fertilize, you're basically growing a last hay cutting of the year. And what we have seen on county agent demonstrations and other records and so on, that oftentimes is the highest quality of the Bermuda grass of the entire year, because you have shorter days, cooler weather, the lignin and fiber doesn't accumulate quite as much as it does back in July, and so you have very good quality. And so in mid-October, when it's still green before that kill and frost, we can have 15, 16, 18% quality protein Bermuda grass, pretty easy. Then after we get into frost, the quality doesn't change that much. It can still be, in that low to mid-teens range, but as we get more rain, frost, things like that, the leaves start falling off, becomes more of a fragile plant, and then the fiber goes up because we're losing the quality components. But even when we get into December, the quality is still in that 10% protein range, somewhere in mid-50s, maybe low 50s, and for dry cows, that's fine. Now, if we have lactating cows, the later we get, we may need to supplement them, so it depends on what you're trying to grow. December, it's not going to be stocker calf feed. Back in October, it may still be okay with a little bit of supplement. So what animals are you trying to graze on it? But as long as we strip graze it, so you're protecting that wire, and you're only giving them just a few day allotment, they'll graze it pretty clean, okay? But if you let them have the whole field and it's frosted, and once it's brown, you probably walk through a field of Bermuda grass that's dormant in the fall, maybe dew on it, and look at your boots. It's just covered with broken leaves, and that's where all your quality is. And so if you turn the cows out on the whole thing, that's what happens. You'll waste a lot and lose your quality. But that's why strip grazing gets important on these. So it doesn't get that bad until you get into late. Now if you get snow or ice on it, that's a different ballgame, because once it melts off, the cows refuse it and they don't graze it, or that's what we've seen. So you stockpile it to where you get to that point where you're high risk of snow and ice, and then after that, stockpile fescue, winter annuals, things like that are better bets then, because that freezing precipitation doesn't hurt those so much. Okay. But anyway, here's different options, but you got to hit these targets, and those targets oftentimes are 30 days ahead of the time when you need that grass to grow. And this is hopefully recorded so you can see this later. But if we're going to plant our annuals, we do that in the spring back here early, but then those annuals won't be ready to graze for 5 weeks or so. Fertilize for stockpile August or September with fescue or Bermuda, but it's not ready till fall. Plant annuals for spring here in October. Going to plant annuals for fall here at the end of August to have here. So see, you always plan that, at least a season ahead, at least 30 days ahead. And then we've got a fact sheet on 300-day grazing getting started. It's got some of these Bermuda grass-based, fescue-based examples to get started. And here's another quote. Cheapest of all feed is pasture because it furnishes a balanced ration at low cost. Cow does her own harvesting. In few cases is the fullest possible use made of pasture. That was in the 1922 USDA Yearbook of Agriculture. Okay. Now I've learned some important forage truths working on this. One is it always rains after a drought. Remember that. You can't predict the weather conditions 30 days from now, but you can predict your forage practices 30 days from now. Always plan at least one season ahead. In case I forgot to say it, always plan at least one season ahead. Okay. So sorry it took so long. Any other questions or discussion? Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. No, fall calving is not norm. Spring calving is the most common in Arkansas, but this herd was fall calving, and that's what we worked with. Now, if you're working on toxic fescue, there is a lot of advantage of having fall calving as far as calving percentage and things like that to help work around that endophyte issue. But again, it depends on what your own operation is. If you have spring calving, a lot of this still works. You just, your plan might be a little different. All the whole farms that we worked with, the producer farms, those were all spring calving.